This video is about Falling Water, my generative art collection that launched on Alba as part of their Flatland show. I'm going to talk about the design influences a little bit later in the video, and also about how it's unashamedly graphic design rather than art, although some would of course argue that they're the same thing, and then a little bit about how I think rules-based generative graphic design is kind of pretty awesome. But first, I wanted to explain why I think that the collection Falling Water works as a whole, with two things I think that both artists can use in their own practice, and then also collectors can use to help understand the work a bit more as a kind of a whole, and that's with algorithmic composition and with a rejection step. It's probably easier just to dive in and show you examples first of what I'm talking about, and then we'll come back to read the design as a whole. Falling Water, by its nature, has a very strong main vertical element, the water, and then 2.5 other vertical elements. The first one is this chunky chevron. The second is this much smaller set of glyphs over here. Three things are happening here. The first is that those two elements are confined to the middle 3/5 of the design. The second is they'll both avoid overlapping the actual falling water. And the third is that if they both appear, the glyphs will snap onto the side of the chevrons, and even more, they'll snap onto the side that's completely opposite to where the water is. That situation doesn't pop up too many times in the 256 outputs, but now that you know it's there, you can see it on the ones that it does appear in. However, rules are made to be broken, and the final smaller vertical element is the barcode, which actually encodes the first few characters of the hash. Now, that barcode, and generally there are a few exceptions, only shows up when the design is in maximalist mode. When there's already lots of other elements, then it can appear. But it doesn't appear just on its own, or if there's like 1 or 2 elements. Everything have to be there. And unlike the chevrons and glyphs, when a barcode appears, the glyphs will snap onto the side of those, the barcode, instead of the chevrons. And because the barcode doesn't avoid the water, as there's already so much going on anyway, it can then start to create these overlaps, but that's on full-on everything mode. So this is the first important thing for artists. Well, I think anyway. I get a sense that when coders or artists turn to generative art and then embrace the randomness, that they're not always thinking about shaping that randomness. Everything is kind of equally random. It's all sort of randomly spread over the whole design. And then as those artists carry on working with randomness, you can see them start to shape it. And I'm not saying it's hard, and this is some real big insight. It's just fun to watch as they move from one way of doing things to another. I'll give you one more example of algorithmic composition. Here are our buildings floating up in the sky. They're constructed from a number of initial points, which define like the bottom corner of the front. And then each of them is given a height, and then a width and a length of the buildings. They all go off to the vanishing points in the distance. As part of this design, I was happy for the buildings to break out of the border and go off the edge of the frame. That was like a design decision that I made. And you can see here on the left, and then here on the right. But despite the original points being placed randomly, the buildings never go off both sides. Well, nearly never, and we'll come to that in a second. So again, this is randomness, but with additional checks in place to make sure it fits in with the overall composition that I'm going for. I'm not letting the pure randomness through, it's kind of controlled. Now, there's a couple of ways to do that. The first is to put lots of rules into your code to make sure certain things do or don't happen. But you can end up with lots of very nested, complicated logic, or worse, this cyclic dependency where you kind of get gridlocked because various features all depend on other ones appearing, and you want the state of earlier features to be affected by later features, which is itself dependent on a middle feature that kind of also depends on the state of the first and last feature. It can get complicated. It sounds impossible, but you can very easily end up in that tangled mess. What I use is a rejection step. Often I'll have like a scoring system. We start at 0, and when I see emergent elements of the artwork appearing that I like, caused by like the interplay of 2 or 3 features, then I assign a couple of points to the score. And if I see elements that I don't like, I can give it a lower or even a negative score. What I mean by this is, for example, we tend to like compositions where it's heavier at the bottom, but I want my code to randomly place all the things. I don't want to write the code to force it down to the bottom. I can assign a higher score when there's around 2/3 of the things in the bottom half of the design, but a negative score if over 90% of the things are in the bottom half, because that's too many. But maybe I like the weird effect of over 90% of the things being in the top half, only if those things are mainly blue. This is handy because you can have a couple of features that are a bit so-so, but when they combine together they work really well, and then you can give them higher points. You don't have to get rid of those features altogether. You can keep the score low for them separately, but really boost them in the occasions when you know they're interesting in certain ways together. Then you put the feature decision script in a big loop that keeps going until the score is over a certain threshold. For Falling Water, I started there with these different incremental values for different things, far more granular, but then I just moved to having each thing having 1 point, and then right at the start of the design deciding I want a minimalistic output where it's got 1 or 2 points, or a maximalistic one where there's 6 or 7 points. It has to score that, and then obviously the ones in between, and it'll keep generating the layouts until it got the score right. However, if you have the chevrons or the glyphs that we talked about, would give them minus 100 points if they clashed with the waterfall. So I didn't have to have rules about where it gets placed, I just rejected it if it was in the wrong place. This way I didn't have to write special rules about if the buildings are going off on both sides to stop that from happening. I just threw the whole thing away by giving it a minus 100 points if that did happen. And that turns out it's a lot easier to do it that way than try to write these rules into code. Jumping back to the barcode for a moment, the barcode only appears in designs that have 6 or more elements, and it's already maximalistic busy design. And in that case, if the glyphs are snapped to the barcode and either of them clash with the Falling Water, then I didn't penalize them. I didn't give them those minus 100 points. The final important thing is to make sure you don't end up in an infinite loop. So I gave each design 1,000 attempts to get it right, to match the correct number of elements, to not overlap the water or go off both edges and so on. And it will just accept the 1001st design no matter what, and give it the style of we choose chaos. In 256 outputs, 2 artworks ended up choosing chaos, and this one has the buildings going off both sides. It's the only one in the whole collection, because it kept looping around. And I love that because, as I said before, one of the joys of having rules is that sometimes it's okay to break them. So if you've seen my posts or videos where I've had a screen full of outputs, that's what I'm doing. I'm getting an overall feeling for the consistency of the outputs, where I'll let it generate a few thousand and then I'll look at them all in one go, spotting the ones that kind of stand out, the ones that I'm not keen on the look of. I'll try and figure out what those ones have in common. What is it about them that I don't like? And then adjust the scoring and then go again. And it went from near the beginning, where everything was just randomly placed everywhere, sort of that even randomness, to where we ended up at the end, where it felt like the composition of all of them was really nailing what I was going for, which I guess is the last bit of advice, is don't try and optimize the randomness too soon. You may have a hunch for how you want the design to go, and most often you'll be right, because you're the artist, and you may start choosing, this thing is only going to happen 10% of the time right at the very beginning. But I think it's worth not dialing those things in initially. Let it all be a bit messy. Let random properties be like properly random, that even spread, and then over time iterate and tune the outputs. Start working with that grain of randomness. Hopefully all of that makes some kind of sense as to why the collection seems to work, and hopefully feels like a cohesive designed whole rather than just being a random generative art. And it's sometimes tricky to see that because you aren't getting to see 80% of the stuff that's being thrown away, just the top 20%, so you don't get to see any of the trash to compare it to. You don't really know that you're not getting these buildings because you don't ever see them, so you're not aware. Anyway, let's go on to the design a little bit. Not that there's much left to say, but we'll go through it. We can blast through this, thankfully. First, image weight. As I mentioned above, designs are often heavier on the bottom of the design, sort of the grounded, the rule of thirds and all that. This design is obviously playing with that. We have this heavy, ponderous building floating up in the sky, so it's a solid structure up where it shouldn't be, and we'll come back to this in a moment. So we're already playing with something unexpected, but we're going to ground it anyway with the falling water that anchors it to the bottom of the frame, and sometimes also the building itself is just off to the side. To sometimes add balance, we often have these curves here, which are added as an element to the bottom of the design, or this larger glyph, which again always appears down at the bottom. If they both appear at the same time, then that glyph is actually tucked into the curves. These are here, as I said, for balance, to balance the top and the bottom half of the design. The glyph is a single large version of those smaller ones that you've seen make up the mini glyphs, but it's been made to be really fat and pudgy, so often the thin gaps that are left behind between those pudges appear to be like the feature rather than glyph itself. You can hide that in the curve. We have one more element down here, which is the 9x9 glyphs. There's sort of rules behind the placement of these squares and curves, but they're pretty simple. These glyphs are again used for balance. They are sort of horizontal and square and fairly regular, unlike the vertical ones that are skinny and hexagonal based. We could get into a whole discussion about hexagons and how they're used to feel more like alien, but we won't do that in here. And the background is, well, it's just background. There's angles, shapes, patterns, and I don't think we need to talk about that much, and I don't think we really need to talk about the length of the lines here in the waterfall, giving it that sense of getting faster as it flows down. I did play a little bit with animating these, but I kept it as static. That's all easy stuff. Instead, let's go look at... Going right back to the beginning, for me, the exhibition was about graphic design rather than art, and we can argue about the distinctions some other time, but I've always had a love of strong graphic design, and something that's always stuck with me about it is how back in the day, and I'm talking the early to mid 1990s, the designs are often trying to be evocative of the future. We were coming up to like the 2000s after all, and also the designs were done by hand, by which I mean in early Photoshop and Illustrator and Corel Draw rather than with code. Although designers were certainly using code to generate vector artwork, the end result was always like this single artwork, this single design for a magazine, print advert, album artwork and the like. So the thought process for me is, what if those designers back then had worked with code and could generate 100 different variations rather than the final one or two that they actually had? Graphic design often has a set of visual rules and instructions that a designer would follow, creating like a few variations and then drilling down to the final design. What if instead we could encapsulate those rules in code and apply modern generative art sensibilities to that, which is how we get here to Falling Water. This particular design is riffing off a Designers Republic album cover design, which took the Falling Water house and then deconstructed it into graphical parts and then other visual elements from like New York and then reconstructing them again. The Falling Water house is a classic design by Frank Lloyd Wright, where the building has these like strong, bold, cantilevered structures that are kind of floating above the softness of the waterfall. The albums of Pop Will Eat Itself, also by the Designers Republic, was another touchstone, although I kind of iterated away from that starting point. I definitely started there. I think the barcode is the only remaining element from that era. The background of the design initially started as riffing on early PlayStation adverts. They leaned into the cross, circle, triangle and square elements quite a lot back then, which is unsurprising as they're strong visual elements, and to make it seem even more like kind of techno and futuristic, they'd often do things in wireframe. So that's where this background comes from. There's a couple of cases where there's a small chance of something slightly different happening. So showing all the shapes is one thing, all the shapes being the same is another. Another thing, I guess, is I spent quite a while really loving the minimalistic outputs. And I actually started at the other end. I wanted this to be an over-the-top maximalist chaos with all the visual elements in there. And when I was putting it together, I really liked that. But sometimes it had spit out this really minimalistic output. And I'll be like, oh, crap, I really like that. And I'd push it that way and my mood would swing back and forth between the two. But of course, with 256 outputs, we can have both, thankfully. Colours, not really any need to talk about them too much. Originally, each element could be picked from its own colour palette, so there's many colour palettes and each one will be assigned a palette. But over time, I started making them share palettes a bit more, so it wasn't too much of an overload. If there were lots of elements, some of them all picking from the same palette, really sort of would pull it together. The other thing I thought about doing was having a white labeled demo copies, which is like when they have vinyl tracks for DJs, a new track which was going to be released or an early remix would be given to DJs, but with a plain white label to hide any information about it, and DJs would do that themselves sometimes. I thought it would be fun to pre-release some white label versions with a palette that wouldn't appear in the final collection, but I couldn't figure out a good way to do that with the Falling Water exhibition and NFTs, so I rolled that palette into the whole collection. There's like a small chance of switching out the palette for these creamy white ones instead. There is a special one that I did for the Shrewsbury Arts Trail here in Shrewsbury that uses a handcrafted gradient background to match the walls of the art gallery that it was put into, and then some smaller ones to demonstrate what's going on. That was kind of fun to do like a special one-off. I'm trying to work out how to do that a little bit more, like one-of-ones separate from a whole big collection. And weirdly, there's a fake one on OpenSea that someone is trying to scam me with, and I actually quite like the look of it, and I'm not really sure what to do with that. Anyway, I think that will probably do it. I really love doing the project. I'm probably going to do a follow-up, which will be either Falling Water 2, which obviously will be different enough, don't worry about that, or another graphics design work exploring like similar ideas and sources of inspiration. Probably that one first, and then anyway, because I have a digital frame over here, I really wanted to make some 16:9 ones as well, some landscape ones. So perhaps I'll create some of those as a digital download on my site. So not NFTs, just desktop and phone wallpapers, old school, right click save. Anyway, done. I promised myself I'd make a video to go with each of my artworks, but also going back and slowly doing all my old projects too. It's going to take a while, so maybe one every couple of months. Next, I think maybe we should do some gen art tutorials, aside from the pen plotting stuff, on how to create projects on FS#, all the way up to maybe FXS params. Anyway, whatever new features they're adding, that sounds like a fun thing to do. And obviously all the pen plotting stuff. I will see you in the next video if you decide to stick around. If not, I hope this was interesting and informative.